Hello, welcome to this session in the Ecosystems track of the Software Engineering in Practice part of the ICSE conference. Arun and I are from Siemens Healthineers, and we would like to share with you here in this talk the topic sharing at scale. It's about an open source software-based license compliance ecosystem. We will structure the presentation in these four areas. We will first have a short introduction and motivation to the topic of open source software and open source software license clearing. We will then briefly show some of the challenges in the area of open source software license clearing. And then the main part of the presentation is about sharing at scale, sharing compliance know-how at scale, where we focus on open source tools for license compliance. And then we close, especially for this audience, with some potential standardization and research topics that may be of interest to you in this space. And this presentation is held by us as Healthineers, but it really reflects a common understanding across the community on these topics. So getting started, the topic of open source is has many benefits as well as challenges. So when you use open source software, if you choose the communities well, you can have a lot less effort, sometimes also much higher quality, because the components that you use are very well tested in many different domains over many years, often also very well written. It's sort of like this is the business card of the developers to show their code, and it's often very well written code. But you cannot know that for sure. You have to really know from the communities that you want to work together with, have a closer look at them, and if you make the right choices, then you can have these benefits. Another advantage is that you avoid the vendor lock-in. It's then sometimes easier to upgrade to newer versions of the software, and you can focus the software development capacity that you have on your area of expertise if you can do a lot more of the sort of standard or commodity parts of your product using open source. And in general, the topic also of transparency and collaboration, that has been sort of the partly, I guess, the mantra of the open source software community. That's also becoming more and more the direction also that the overall software engineering community is going. Those topics are becoming much more important these days. But in order to achieve all of these benefits, you have to on the right side now, you have to handle all the license obligations and the copyrights for the open source software components that you're using correctly, right? If you have, when you are using software components, you don't own the software per se, you own the license. You have the license, and then you can use the software in the ways that the license describes. So it's, inherently different than, for example, buying a hardware component where you can do with it what you want. So this is a important understanding, and underscores the importance of adhering to the obligations and the requirements of the licenses that are in the software components that you use in your various products. There's also a large diversity of such licenses. So there's thousands of different open source licenses out there, and you have to know the ones that you're using. And the topic of software licenses, it's also maybe important to mention, it's the same whether you're using commercial third-party components or open source software components. In either case, you have to make sure you handle the license obligations correctly. There is no guarantee of service and support by the community. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you have to choose your communities well. To make sure that that you're working with one that is maybe well maintained and does have a high quality. There's some aspects on where the automation of the license compliance is not fully automatable. So those are some topics we'll be getting into in a little bit. And you have to deal with the large diversity and the constant change. So we need to be able to master that, but we need to master that actually anyway, whether we're using open source software or other kinds. That's the way the whole community is going. So we have to be better at being able to master the fast changes that are coming at us faster and faster overall in the software engineering community throughout the world in our activities. So not just at our company, but overall. So some of the challenges that I mentioned in the license compliance topic are mentioned on this slide. So our top priority is, of course, to make sure we have a correct license compliance. So that's, number one, unequivocally. And within that, it's important to be as automated as possible in order to do that efficiently. And whether you are using commercial based approaches or open source based approaches for your license compliance, in either case, there are still a number of challenges related to full automation. There are topics, for example, that many of the components or a number of the components have dual licenses, and one has to have a closer look, in our case, typically with a person, an expert that evaluates that and discusses that with the team, which is the relevant choice to be made here. So it's not something that is fully automatable. Mapping accurate versions to the identified licenses is also a topic it's important to do correctly. And if there's any of these edge cases where there is any degree of uncertainty, then it's important to have an expert have a look at this. Is also, for the example, the case with the incomplete and redundant copyright information. And the third point listed here is some tools look just at the main license for the components, but in our view, it's important to actually go down to the file level. If you have components inside of components inside of components, to n levels, you actually have to go down to the file level at the most detailed level to look for the relevant licenses to make sure that you catch all of the cases that you need to catch. And in this space, I'd like to go now more into the open source based license compliance tooling topic. The Linux Foundation has a number of activities in this space that we are also a member of the communities working in this area. The Linux Foundation has, for example, an automated compliance tooling project, and it strives to increase the interoperability and the usability of these tools. There are 5 main projects that are listed here that work on this topic. So they focus on different aspects of this topic. So for example, the Fossology tool is one that is a license identification, a license scanner, and also scans for copyright and export control statements. The open source review toolkit is excellent, for example, at recognizing the dependencies of projects and checking the source code and analyzing those dependencies. And the quartermaster is also an important tool in this space. And the last one on the list, Turn, is also used for finding the metadata of packages that are installed. SPDX is a topic that's maybe many of you have already heard of. So the Software Package Data Exchange, it's a open standard driven by the Linux Foundation for the software bill of material. So it's important for us to be able to know exactly what third-party components are in our products. And the SPDX is a open standard, a de facto standard for describing this. And in addition to the automated compliance tooling project of the Linux Foundation, there's also a project called OpenChain at the Linux Foundation. And this is a project that defines key requirements for for high quality open source compliance programs. And it's also a very useful free resource for information on training and policies and how to handle the topic of open source license compliance correctly. So if you're not familiar with it, I can highly recommend it. Our company, as well as Siemens and a number of other major companies, are conformant to this standard, and it's an important and useful resource in this space. So this is one slide taken from the curriculum training slides that the OpenChain project has, a little bit adapted. It shows on the left that you basically feed into the systems your own software, your commercial software, your third-party open source software, and then you analyze it with these various tools to look for the various licenses, to handle these edge cases, to document which components you're using, what their licenses are, how you're adhering to those licenses, and checking them against your policy, and creating all the documents that you need to produce for being able to use these open source components for your products. So having the correct notices and attributions, the written offer, and so on. So this sort of gives you an idea of the process that you go through to do correct open source license compliance. But it's not just open source you have to do. You have to, of course, know also your commercial licenses in addition. And this slide shows within the OpenChain group, there is also a work group called the Open Source Tooling Work Group. You can see also a pointer to their GitHub site here at the bottom left. So this shows a number of the tools in this space. You saw already Fossology or Open Source Review Toolkit were already mentioned in some of the previous slides, but also there's a component repository called Software 360 or a policy checker called Software 360 Antenna. So this is showing a sort of a typical set of these tools where they would be used in the development infrastructure. Also on the left, there's also some public compliance artifact repositories, such as Software Heritage, that are very useful areas to involve in this topic space. So getting into the software engineering research and standards topics, there are some initial approaches where software engineering research might be able to make this topic a little bit easier to handle. So for example, in the machine learning space, when we identify licenses, we typically do this with rule-based scanners, for example. And there are some possibilities of applying also machine learning in this space. So one of the challenges here is that you have, so to say, the risk of having a biased training set, because if you're trying to look at all of the licenses that may be possible to be used, this list of licenses is very skewed. There is maybe the top 100 licenses are very, very commonly used, like Apache or MIT licenses. They're very commonly used, and there are some other licenses that exist, but they are very rarely used. And so when you are looking for data to train your machine learning model, perhaps you can only do this for the very commonly used licenses. Another area that's more in the standardization is if we're wanting to do more automation in this space, it would be very useful to have more normalized structure of the license texts. So currently, anybody writing such open source components can put their license description in the source code in any way that they want, and the license compliance scanners have to be able to recognize that. So having a more normalized format and structure for that would be useful. When matching component names, there is also, because there's no standard Sometimes the challenge is this exactly the same component name or not? So some fuzzy matching is another area that would be helpful in some cases. And also there's some initial research in the area of having enhanced license scanners and decider agents. So for example, to be able to have maybe a hybrid approach of having a rule-based approach as combined with some kind of machine learning approaches. And so there is some initial work in this space, and I hope this has at least piqued your interest for working in this space. So it's a very open community. I guess the name also implies such. And if there is interest in sort of some research topics in this area, I welcome you to take up contact with us or this tooling work group or the OpenChain contacts. And I think we would be interested in hearing on some of the improvements that perhaps the software engineering research community could bring to the table here. So the closing topics, the key takeaways is to take advantage of the growing amount of open source software used in today's systems throughout the world. So not just in our company, but everywhere in the world. It will be necessary to automate as much as possible the open source license clearing. And there's a number of challenges that need to be resolved here. In order to have both the high degree of accuracy that is essential, as well as a high degree of automation, as much as that is possible. And um, this is talk has been about the open source based ecosystems driven by the Linux Foundation, which addresses various parts of this open source license compliance topic area, and I've given a few examples of how it may be fruitful to apply software engineering research in this very practical area of the software engineering community, and would look forward to continuing the conversation outside of this conference. So Arun and I thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to potentially hearing from you in this community. Thank you very much for your attention.